good to be with y'all this nice spring morning. It's starting to feel like spring, isn't it? My prayer is it doesn't feel like summer soon. Let's just stay in between here for a while. Well, it's good to be with you, whether you're here, Cambridge, Oberlin, online. It's just so good that we can gather together as a church body. And we're going to be in Mark chapter 13 today. As you can see, we're getting closer and closer to the conclusion of the book, which is also Easter. So you can just mentally know that's where we're aiming at here, is we're going to finish on Easter, the 16th on Easter and the 15th on Good Friday, because that's Good Friday, and you can just see where we're heading, right? This is easy to see. I hope you brought your Bible, because that's where we're going to be today, there in chapter 13. The last few years have been kind of interesting, haven't they? Is that maybe an understatement? Been a little interesting in the world, some things happening. And so I was thinking about this, kind of the turmoil of the last few years. I happened to be listening to something just a few days ago where it was recorded in 2015. And in 2015, they made the comment, man, it's been a difficult year, hasn't it? And I thought, just wait, buddy. You got 21 coming, and 20, and it just wait. And I wonder how, as we've kind of navigated these last few years of kind of craziness, how we have digested it. How each of us have taken our faith and what's happening in the world and sort of seen what's happening and sort of put the two together, and how do we reconcile these and help it all to work together well and to make sense of it, right? And what I've found is that there's kind of this spectrum, and for some, maybe we don't react as much to it. As we see our faith in these events, that we don't as they rub against each other, it doesn't impact us as much. It doesn't strike us quite as deeply, and we just sort of roll with all of it, right? And we are strong in our faith. We understand what's happening in the world, but the two, there isn't this huge conflict or tension between the two. And then there's others that there is this huge conflict, these two parts of our lives really come together in a strong way. And there can be this really strong reaction in terms of trying to have our faith make sense of the world, and how does the world fit into our faith. And those folks, I generally have found lately, like to talk about the end times, right? And they like to try to see how all of this is fitting together with these different parts of our lives. And today our chapter 13, is one of the chapters that those folks run to pretty quickly. And you're going to see why. It's crystal clear, okay? Where they run to this, and they're like, okay, based on chapter 13 or Matthew 24 or Luke 17 or these other places, how do all these fit together? And they get really digging deep into the timelines and the scenarios and the graphs and the charts and all these things, right? And I want us to acknowledge that today, and we're going to talk a lot about it. But I also want us to approach today with a slightly different mindset, okay? I want us to kind of set the spectrum aside for a moment, and I want us to come at chapter 13, placing ourselves in the disciples' shoes, these men that he's talking to, because this whole chapter is him teaching his disciples. And I want us to put ourselves in their shoes, and I want us also, as best we can, to put ourselves in Jesus' shoes and to ask ourselves, what do we think his purpose was as he was teaching this chapter? Okay? Do we think his purpose was to help us create charts and timelines? Do we think his purpose was for us to just ignore kind of all the world events together and just ignore how these may be connected? Or does he have a different heart, somewhere in the middle, where these two are to come together, and we are to see how we digest our world and our faith in a way that's really actually helpful to us? And so here's the question that I want us to ask ourselves as we read through this whole chapter, okay? Here's the question. What does it look like for us to be faithful followers of Jesus in the midst of chaos? ... no matter where it falls on the timeline. Okay? So that's the question. What does it look like for us to be faithful followers of Jesus in the midst of the chaos, no matter where it falls on the timeline? Okay? So with that in mind, let's take, actually, I got two requests, okay, as we move through this. I have two requests. First is, there are many very smart, very studied people that have more initials behind their names than you and I, who have spent lots of time studying this, who love Jesus, who love the church, who want to be absolutely faithful to God and his word and to his people, and very much disagree on this chapter, okay? And so, if you disagree from me, here's what I would ask. Let's be unified, okay? This is secondary. This is not primary. So let's be unified, because all kinds of people disagree. That's one of my least favorite things about end time stuff, is there's so much diversity that God only knows literally who is right. Okay, because there's just so much diversity. And so that's why I personally just try to sort of hedge away from it, because there is so much diversity and it tends to be more divisive than unifying. So that's my first request, is let's be unifying. Here's my second request, is that if you're in a life team or you're in a Bible study who's going to study through this, or if you're going to in some like coffee group that talks through this or whatever it may be, here's what I'm going to ask. Put away the timelines. Put away the news. Let's just focus on Jesus and his pastoral heart, okay? Because if we get distracted by the timelines and we start arguing and debating about that, we've missed the point, all right? And we actually are in risk of dividing whatever that group is, because like I said, this tends to be really divisive. And so let's not do that, okay? Pinky swear, we agree? Okay, good. All right, so now, let's go through this. Let's approach this, and let's understand what is happening here. So these last three chapters have come in quick succession, so we have to sort of understand all of them to get to where we're at, right? So we had Palm Sunday when Jesus came into town, when he rode in, and everybody crowned him as Messiah, mistaking what that was. He left for the night. He came back the next day. Remember, he cleared out the temple, okay, that raised a big ruckus and shut it down because what they were doing was not appropriate. And he said, we're not doing this anymore. The king is here. He was asserting his authority, and he cleared the place out. Remember, he left then, and the next day, then he came back. So we're on like the third day in a row here. He came back. And remember, he was confronted by every flavor of Jewish official, right? Who came to him wanting to demand, why do you think you have the authority to do this? And he answered them, right? He answered all of them, one by one by one. And then he had the scribe who came to him actually seeming pretty curious about what was happening. And then the last chapter finished with him teaching, as they were teaching just his disciples, as they were sitting and watching the offering box. And he used a woman who gave very little, but she was very poor. And so for her, it was a lot of money, even though the dollar amount was small, right? And he used that as a teaching example for his disciples. And so we are still in the temple. That's where we pick this up. We're going to see right here they're leaving, and that's where we're at, okay? But you just mentally get where we're at. So just go back the last couple weeks and think about the atmosphere, think about the tensions, think about all the confrontations he's had, everything he's done, and just mentally put ourselves back in that place, okay? And so here we are. We're in chapter 13, verse 1. Now, as Jesus was going out of the temple court, so he's leaving now, one of his disciples, we don't know which one, but one of them said to him, "Teacher, look at these tremendous stones and buildings. Look at this architecture. Isn't this amazing?" And Jesus said to him, "Do you see these great buildings? Not one stone will be left on another. All will be torn down." I don't think that's the response he thought he was going to get, was it? Now, I don't know how much you've traveled. I hope you've got the chance to travel the world. I hope if you haven't, you will, because in order to kind of understand this, you have to have traveled just a little bit. Because here in this neck of the woods, we don't appreciate architecture like they do in the ancient world. And if you've been in Europe or the Middle East or Asia, architecture looks completely different than here, right? And the size and the scope of buildings is completely different than here. And the way buildings were built was completely different than here, to where you would have these massive structures with large stones, large construction. And whenever I go to these places, my mind is boggled to think that 500 years ago or 1,000 years ago, or in some cases, I've been in buildings that are like 1,800 years old. They built these huge stone structures. How did they do it? I have no idea. But they do it, and it's just stunning. And this disciple, whichever one it is, he's noticing this, right? He's noticing the architecture. And I try to imagine what the temple would have looked like at this time. I've been in some really cool like religious places in the world. I've had the opportunity to travel enough and be in some places that are just mind-blowing. I just kind of was brainstorming through this. I've been to St. Paul's Cathedral in London. I've been to St. Mark's in Venice. I've been to Notre Dame before it was a convertible. I've been to St. Patrick's Cathedral in Dublin. The Pantheon in Rome was just stunning. The Hagia Sophia, which was built as a church and then went to a mosque and has gone back and forth a couple times in Istanbul, and St. Peter's Basilica at the Vatican. I tell you, that building is by far the most stunning of all of them I've been into. I looked it up just as a reminder this week. The sanctuary is 102,000 square feet and 150 feet in height. A 15-story building could go inside the sanctuary. You just look up at it, and it just, like, it's so big, you can't tell how big it is. It is a stunning building. And this temple that they're looking at, it was built by Solomon, and then it was torn down by the Babylonians, and then it was rebuilt after the exile. And then Herod, a couple centuries before, as a way of getting in good with the Jews, rebuilt it, kind of remodeled and expanded it even more. So this would have been a massive, beautiful structure that they would have been inside, with a courtyard and then the inner part of the temple and then the innermost part, and just it would have been this huge, beautiful structure. And this disciple, whichever one it is, whether he had never been there, I have to believe he had been there before, but he noticed it. And just in the same way, I walk into some of these large facilities and you just stand there and you're just in awe of how did they do this? That's the moment he has, where he's like, whoa, Jesus, check this out. And Jesus' response is, yeah, unfortunately, it's going to be torn down. This is a scandalous statement. This isn't just a statement of like something's going to happen and the building won't be here. This is a scandalous statement because he's predicting the downfall of their faith and how they know it, how they practice it today. He's predicting the downfall of the Jewish governmental system, because remember, their faith and their government are in one, right? So he's predicting that. He's saying this whole thing is going to change. And in their history, of course, the exile happened when the Babylonians came in and destroyed it, and so they have that reference. But for them, it would be just mind-blowing to think, this is going to happen again? Like, it happened once, and that's hard enough to believe. It's hard for them to process that it could possibly happen again. What Jesus is predicting here is significant, because remember that the temple is this intersection of heaven and earth, right? And so if you take away the intersection, you have no intersection. This is a big deal. And it doesn't per se give the disciples response, but as we go to verse 3, they're now sitting on the Mount of Olives. And if you go from the Temple Mount, you have to go down into the valley and across to the Mount of Olives, and you can see across from one to the other. And so they've gone down and across, and I don't know how long that walk would have taken, 30 minutes, an hour, I don't know. But they spent that time, and I have to believe that whichever disciple this was following Jesus with the rest of the disciples, and they were murmuring, trying to figure out what it is he's talking about. I picture them as he's like, I picture pretty determined leaving, right? After he's had all these confrontations, and they're back behind and they're like, can you believe what he said? What do you think he meant by that? He couldn't possibly mean this, could he? I don't know. Why do you expect me to know? Because you're the know-it-all, right? You're Peter, come on. Like, and I see them like bickering and arguing, trying to figure out what it is he just said. And at some point they're like, okay, I'll ask him, all right? And so verse 3, they get over to the other side, and he goes and he sits on the Mount of Olives. Now, I have to believe this wasn't an accident, that he knew where he was sitting. Because, see, all throughout Scripture, the Mount of Olives is a very important location. In the book of Ezekiel, God's glory moves from the temple east to the Mount of Olives when it leaves the temple when it's destroyed. In Zechariah, the Mount of Olives is the setting where judgments are made over Israel from that place. I have to believe that he is sitting where he is sitting, not because he was tired, but because it was the place he needed to be to say what he needed to say. And so, there he is. He's sitting on the Mount of Olives opposite the temple. You can see it there ahead of him. And Peter, James, and Andrew ask him privately. They say, "Tell us, when will these things happen? And what will be the sign that these things are about to take place?" They're curious. They're genuinely curious. They're saying, what you just said is really stunning, and we're trying to make sense of this. Help us make sense of it. Now, he's going to answer their question. That's the rest of this chapter. This is known as the Olivet Discourse, the discourse or the sermon on the Mount of Olives, so the Olivet Discourse. Okay, this is the longest, most significant teaching he gives in one shot in the book of Mark. Okay, so Mark is really honing in on this for us. And as he does this discourse, he's answering these two questions that they just asked. He's going to answer it for them. They genuinely asked. He's going to genuinely answer in a very unique way. And as he gives this answer, we need to understand a couple things. That Jesus is going to answer in a very poetic and prophetic way, similar to other poets and prophets have in the past. This is going to be very similar to what we should expect out of this sort of literature that points down the road of time. And as we do, there's this concept that the theologians have developed based on this teaching. It's this idea of horizons, okay? And I want you to picture for a moment that you are sitting kind of on an elevated bluff maybe, and you're looking out over hundreds of miles because it drops down in front of you, and then there's a series of hills or mountains and that lead up to a larger mountain clear at the back, okay? And that mountain looks like it's not very far from you, but the reality it is hundreds of miles out there, okay? And the concept, the picture that the scholars use is that as prophets are pointing forward, as they're pointing towards the big mountain in the back, sometimes it's hard to tell which mountain you're on. This mountain, or that mountain. And many times the prophets even use the description of this mountain to describe that mountain and vice versa. And that there are things that happen both on this mountain and on that mountain. And so it's hard to tell whether we're talking about this mountain or that mountain. Does that make sense? And many times the prophets are intentionally talking about both of them. Okay, does this make sense? This sort of horizon idea, it's a way theologians help us to understand prophetic literature. And so as he's going to answer here, over the next few moments, we need to be asking ourselves, which mountain is he talking about? Okay, because he's talking about several of them. Okay, let me get down here. Okay, so verse 5 through 23 is his answer to their first question. And then verses 24 through 27 is his answer to their second question. Okay, so here he goes. He's giving this farewell discourse, if you will. By the way, this is also interesting, and I think this shades how we should understand this some, that it's more maybe than just end times, timelines and things, because he's giving an end of life, they don't know it yet, but he is in just a couple days, discourse, where he is showing them how to live, in the same way that prophets and major figures we've had in the past have done the same thing. Jacob does the same thing. Moses, Joshua, Samuel, all do these end-of-life discourses where they're preparing those that they're leaving behind on how to live without them. Okay, and as you read through it, and again, you come back to our question, how do we live in the midst of chaos? How are we faithful in the midst of chaos? You very much see that is what Jesus is doing here. Okay? All right, so let's continue. We're in verse 5. Let me clear my throat. Feels like it's stuck right there. I can't get it out. Okay. All right, verse 5. Jesus began to say to them, so he's answering them, "Watch out that no one misleads you. Many will come in my name, saying, 'I am he,' and they will mislead many. When you hear of wars and rumors of wars, do not be alarmed. These things must happen, but the end is still to come. For nation will rise up in arms against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. There will be earthquakes in various places, and there will be famines. These are but the beginning of birth pains. All right, so what is it that he's telling us as trying to pastor us? We're putting ourselves in the shoes of the disciples. How is it that he's pastoring us to live without him? The first thing he says is to watch out that no one misleads you. There will be those who try to mislead you. There will be those who are false messiahs who come after him and say that they are Jesus returning. And he's saying, watch out for them. These people will come. They're going to try to mislead you. Be careful who you trust. Be discerning. Be wise in those who are claiming to be him. Okay? Second thing is he says, don't be alarmed. Don't be alarmed. There's going to be all kinds of things happening. Wars, rumors of wars, all these things. Don't be alarmed. Don't let these things scare you. And then he gives an explanation. He says, they're not happening because it's the end times. He's saying they're happening because that's the world we live in. We live somewhere between Genesis 3 and the end. Therefore, we live in a world that has wars and famines and evil and injustice. These things are going to happen. They have happened for all of time and eternity. The difference between today and then is 24-hour news cycles and social media, where we now know about a volume of these things we didn't know about before, not because they weren't present, but because we simply didn't know it. But they've been present the whole time, in different ways, in different places, all throughout humanity. These have been here. And he's clear. He says, don't be alarmed. These things have to happen. It's the place we live. It's the time we live. There will be wars, the nations up against nations. There will be earthquakes. There will be famines. These things are what it means to live here. And they're just the beginning of birth pains. They're beginning of a bigger process. Now, those of you that have been around birthing children, you know that it generally isn't a real fast process, isn't it? Some of you it is. For us, it was really fast. Our second one, we said, hey, doctor, just so you know, the first one went really fast. He said, oh, yeah, no. It's going to go fast. When it happens, it's going to go fast, right? And he did. He came right along. But birth process takes a little bit. It starts with a few contractions here and there, a little discomfort. The woman feels things moving, feels things changing, but it's slow and slow and slow. So Jenna, here, I'm just giving you a tutorial, Jenna. Just wait, right? Right, here it comes. And then it ramps up, right? And it ramps up and it ramps up. And then it gets until what happens? New life is born. All of these things are part of this process of new birth. It's just part of what is going to happen to have a new kingdom, a new way of living, going back to how it should be to be born. That's what it is. So don't be alarmed. Verse 9, you must watch out for yourselves. You will be handed over to councils and beaten in synagogues. You will stand before governors and kings because of me as a witness to them. That's interesting. Why is it that we're before them? To be a witness to them. First, the gospel must be preached to all nations. When they arrest you and hand you over for trial, don't worry about what to say, but say whatever is given to you at the time. For it is not you speaking, but the Holy Spirit. Brother will hand over brother to death, and father his child. Children will rise against parents and have them put to death. You'll be hated by everyone because of my name. But the one who endures to the end will be saved. What has he told us here? To watch out for ourselves. Persecution is coming. Expect it. It's going to happen. So be ready. Be on the lookout. We will be unfairly tried. We will be punished or beaten or, as it says below, killed because of our faith. Know it's going to happen. Now, depending on which mountain you're looking at throughout all this sounds a lot like the book of Acts, doesn't it? But we also know you and I are not excluded from this. There are martyrs all over this world today. This isn't a thing of the past or a thing of the future. It's a thing of today. There are people dying for their faith today. And as Acts 1:8 happens, going out to all the world, which is there in verse 10, we know this sort of thing is going to happen. We know there will be persecution. We know that the tensions this will bring about amongst people is going to be there, even to the point of families coming against one another. That if you are under the impression that what we believe is normal in our world, you haven't traveled enough. Because what we believe is incredibly unique. There are far more people on this planet today and throughout history who don't believe what we believe than those that do. So by believing it, there are going to be tensions. There's going to be trouble. We can expect it. And so when we get into those situations and we are arrested, we are persecuted, we are tried, we are pressed to the fire, we should abide in the Holy Spirit as to what to say. Because we can all sit here and worry about it, right? We can get worked up about what would I say? I don't know either. But in that moment, if we abide in him, his Spirit will tell us exactly what to say or not to say. And we see that demonstrated by Jesus just in a couple short days, aren't we? These are things we could expect, but the encouragement is in the very last verse there, verse 13, that he who endures to the end will be saved. How is our faith going to endure? In the midst of all this, in the midst of all this pressure that's going to come against us, will our faith, will our trust in him endure through it to the end? That's a big question, isn't it? But we should take encouragement that is what he's looking for, is that endurance of faith. That is what's going to be important. It's going to test us and test us and test us. And are we able and willing to endure in our faith? And so now he continues, verse 14. But when you see the abomination of desolation, that's a very unique term. We're going to come back to that. Standing where it should not be, and then we have parentheses. That means this is something Mark is telling us about what Jesus said. This isn't Jesus' words, but Mark's words. Let the reader understand. So he wants us to as we're reading this, as he's writing it, to understand. He's saying there's a hyperlink, a connection we need to make. Do we get it? He's like hinting us along, right? So when we see the abomination of desolation standing where it ought not to be, then those in Judea must flee to the mountains. The one on the roof must not come down or go inside to take anything out of his house. The one in the field must not turn back to get his cloak. Woe to those who are not pregnant, and to those who are pregnant, and those who are nursing their babies in those days. Pray that it may not be winter, for in those days there will be suffering unlike anything that has happened from the beginning of creation that God created until now and ever will happen. And if the Lord has not cut short those days, no one would be saved. But because of the elect, because of those who believe, whom he chose, he has cut them short, meaning the days of suffering. Then if anyone says to you, look, there is Christ, or look, there he is, do not believe him. For false messiahs and false prophets will appear and perform signs and wonders and deceive, if possible, the elect. Be careful. I have told you everything ahead of time. I've given you the answer to the test already. So this abomination of desolation is a very unique term. It appears in Daniel chapter 9. And I encourage you this week, if you really want to study this out, go read Daniel chapter 9. You're going to see a whole chapter where Daniel is addressing Israel's unfaithfulness, where Daniel is saying that they have been guilty of rebelling against God and the judgment is forthcoming before a heavenly visitor comes and confirms that, yes, this is the case. Yes, it is true, and yes, it is coming. And so we had this happen back in Daniel's time. Between Daniel and Jesus' time, we had the Babylonian exile, where Babylon came in and overtook Jerusalem in a very brutal way, where they destroyed the temple, they desecrated it, they abused it, spiritually speaking, before eventually being taken out of the land, right? And what also is coming is beginning in 66 AD and going till 70 AD, a 4-year invasion of Rome. Rome was already there, but they came in militaristically in a much more severe way against Christians and against the Jews to purge Jerusalem. It took a very long time. It was very brutal. It was not pleasant. If you go to Rome today, there's this arch called the Arch of Titus. Titus was the military commander that led this. And if you go look on the Arch of Titus, there are little pictures of all of his conquests. Not all of them, but many of them, right? And if you go look on the inside, there's a picture of this happening, of his conquest of Jerusalem. And when they came in and they destroyed the city, they destroyed the temple, they plundered it, took anything of value out of it, and they burned as much as they could. And that is when the temple was destroyed. When his prediction from verse 2 came to pass in a very literal sense in that day and time. Now it says here later, it's going to talk about all this will pass within their generation. A generation is generally 40 years. We're well within 40 years between these two times. He's saying that these things will happen. There will be a desolation like there already has been again in the future. And so what is their response? It's to flee, to get out. What is our response when the fire comes right to our door? We may need to get out. We may need to flee. And of course, the picture comes back to the idea of Lot and Sodom and when it was destroyed and they were told to get out of the city. And what did they do? They hung around. They wanted to see. They kept being hopeful that no, it wouldn't actually be destroyed, right? And that didn't work out well for them. He's saying, just get out, leave. Judgment has come. Your presence isn't going to stop the judgment from happening. It's going to happen either way. And so prepare for it. Be ready for it. It's happening. And then he gives us this little bit of encouragement, if you will, in verse 20, that the Lord will cut these days short. The Lord will make them shorter than they could otherwise be. And the reason why is because there will be faithful people present. Because of the elect, those who have chosen to be faithful. Their faith will cause him to be merciful and gracious in the midst of the judgment. And then he concludes it, to look out for false prophets. Look out for the people who say they know something they don't actually know. And they're saying, he's coming. He's right over there. Look, there's the Messiah. He's saying, please do not give these people your credit card and sign up for their newsletter. I'm serious. He's warning us. And he said it ahead of time. He said right there, the last sentence, be careful. I'm giving you the answer to the test. I'm telling you it's coming. Don't act surprised. It's going to happen. And so now he's answered their first question about the destruction of the temple. It'll happen within their generation. It'll happen in these ways. He has painted the picture, and he's shown them how to live in the midst of that chaos, right? And so now, verse 24, he shifts to their second question, which actually is articulated slightly different in Matthew, so you may want to go read between those two to get a little different idea of what they said, but it's the same question. And so in verse 24, but in those days, after that suffering, the sun will be darkened and the moon will not give its light. The stars will be falling from heaven and the powers in the heavens will be shaken. Then everyone will see the Son of Man arriving in the clouds with great power and glory. Then he will send angels, and they will gather his elect from the four winds, from the ends of the earth to the ends of heaven. Now, what's interesting is, remember the mountaintops. Which mountain is he on? Which mountain's he talking about? Because here's what's interesting, is the first 2.5 verses here are quotes from Isaiah 13 and Daniel 7. Isaiah 13 is a quote, a section about the downfall of Babylon. Remember, they had come in and they'd wiped out Israel? Well, Isaiah 13 is talking about their downfall. That's kind of interesting, that he's quoting something from the past, and what it meant was actually the downfall of the evil empire, not the good empire. How does that fit? The best explanation I can find is he is equating their downfall to the downfall of Israel. That Israel has become so corrupt and so unfaithful that it's hard to tell the difference between the two. Those are harsh words, but that's where he's quoting from. And then the second quote is from Daniel 7, which I'd encourage you to go read that whole chapter. That's very interesting on this, because that is the chapter about the Son of Man riding from his death and destruction up to the right hand of God. So it's his death and resurrection and his ascension. Some would say, depending on the mountain you're looking at, that's when he has come back and then is going back to the new heaven and earth, right? That's the difference in the mountain you're looking at. Both of them appear to be saying the same thing in different ways. But these descriptions of his return, of how he will come and sort of culminate what it is that he is up to, whether it's in a few days or whether we're talking in the future. And as the elect, all of those who believe are gathered under him. Again, some people say that's the church, others say it's the end times. Evil doesn't get the final word. He does win. He's giving this confirmation of his victory in the end. And then he goes back to the fig tree, and we've addressed the fig tree a couple times already, right? We've looked at how it's used as a parable, an example for us. And even back into the Old Testament, we see how it's used as this illustration of Israel and who Israel is. And so we have this example. He says, learn this parable from the fig tree. Whenever its branch becomes tender and puts out its leaves, remember we talked about this a couple weeks ago, right? And puts out its leaves, you know that summer is near. Remember, that's how he knew it should have had fruit, because even though it was springtime, it should have had those things on it, and it didn't, okay? So you know that summer is near. So also you, when you see these things happening, know that it's near. It's right at the door. I tell you the truth, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will never pass away. He's using the fig tree. He's coming back to that example and this idea of we know the seasons based upon how the fig tree is in bloom, right? And so he's using that as an illustration for all these things that he's talked about. And he's saying the way you're going to know when they're about to happen is just be aware of the seasons. Understand what's happening. Understand the kind of life cycle of things, just like the fig tree. And understand that, okay, summer's near, right? And then this last paragraph, I'll be honest, this is my favorite paragraph of the bunch. But as for that day or hour, no one knows it, neither angels in heaven nor the Son, no one except the Father. Now, we could go down a really big theological rabbit trail with that one, couldn't we? But that goes back to up above, the false prophets. Those who say they know, they're saying they know something that he doesn't. He himself doesn't. So watch out. Stay alert. For you do not know when the time will come. There isn't some puzzle we can put together and figure it out. We won't know. It is like a man going on a journey. He left his house and put his slaves in charge, assigning each to his work, and commanded the doorkeeper to stay alert. This sounds a lot like the parable we had a couple weeks ago, doesn't it? Stay alert then, because you do not know when the owner of the house will return, whether during evening, at midnight, when the rooster crows, or at dawn, or else he will find you asleep when he returns suddenly. What I say to you, I say to everyone, stay alert. You see how many times he says stay alert? Be aware, stay alert. That's the point. That we are to be ready. We're to be ready. We are to be expectant of it. That even if there is no puzzle we can put together, if there's no way we can know ahead of time, be ready. Be doing what it is we've been tasked to do as the church. To be diligent in it. Right there in verse 34, to be doing the assignments that have been charged to us. The question is, as a church, what is it we are to be doing between that time and this time? What is it? Because that's what we're supposed to be doing. Making disciples. Go back to the Great Commission and then the Great Commandment. Love your neighbor, love the Lord. Like we could go through lists of dozens of these things, right? Of what it means to be the church, what God has put us here to do, the purpose for our being here. I hope we're doing it. I hope that's who we are. I hope that if the owner walks back into the vineyard, he won't find us asleep on cruise control, saying, well, we did it once, or I was planning to do it later. But I hope he finds us actually doing it, actually working. That we're not asleep at the wheel, but we're being faithful. Here's the fact of the matter. It doesn't matter where we're at on the timeline if we're being faithful today. Because if he chooses to come back today, we'll be found to be faithful. We'll be found to be doing what we've been called to do. Stay alert. Be ready. I found it interesting. Last night I was reading through this and my son came and sat beside me and he saw this paragraph and he goes, look, it says stay alert and be ready like 4 times in the paragraph. I said, yeah. What do you think we should do? What do you think the point of it is? And he goes, to stay alert and be ready. I said, yeah. Repetition is important. So here Jesus is. He's closed out his final discourse. He's closed out his final instructions to his disciples, sitting on this mountain looking across at the temple that he just used as the word picture, as the visual for what is to come and as the setting for pointing forward. And when we go then to answer our question, what does it look like for us to be faithful followers of Jesus in a time of chaos? Here's his answer. Watch out, because there will be false messiahs. Be wise, be aware, be discerning. Don't fall for it. Don't be alarmed by the world's chaos. That's the world we live in. I don't like what's happening any more than you do. But don't be alarmed. Watch out for persecution, because it's coming. And we can spend a lot of our time trying to avoid the persecution, trying to pretend it's not there, trying to keep ourselves safe, but it's there. And one day it will come to us. Maybe not you, but to us. And when it does, the Holy Spirit will be there. And so, can we abide in him? Do we have that kind of faith to abide in him in that moment so we know exactly what to say? We're to endure in our faith. The idea of enduring builds into the definition. This may not be easy. Endure in faith. And when the heat of judgment comes, we may need to flee. And that's okay. We may need to leave that place. We're to be faithful, if for no other reason than to help all of us have the time of testing be shortened. If for no other reason, that one. We're to be careful of false teachers. Don't believe them. Don't fall for their lies. Their claims of knowing something they don't know. We're to be expectant of his return. He's coming. Are we ready? Do we expect it? Do we hope that it's today? Do we long for it to happen? Do we live today in light of knowing it may be today or tomorrow? Do we live with that kind of urgency, that sort of understanding of our lives? Or are we asleep? Are we working diligently at kingdom work? as he has placed us here to do? Are we being faithful in that way? Are we staying alert, or are we asleep? Like I said, are we here, or is our heart, are our minds in tune and attention and on point? Or are we coasting? We can't grow weary. We can't grow weary. No matter how messy and chaotic it gets, we can't grow weary. And we have to be ready. This chapter, yes, it's about Jesus' time. And yes, it's about the end times. And yes, it's about this time. And I hope that we have sat at his feet today on that mountaintop. We've heard his teaching. We now know, as he hoped we would, in his last discourse, just days before his death, we would know how to live in the middle of chaos. We'd know how to be faithful followers of Jesus in the midst of chaos, no matter when we are on the timeline. That's my hope for us today. And so would you pray with me, please? Father, I know as I studied through this, the idea of trying to just first understand this, but then, Father, to actually picture many of these things is really difficult. Father, I know why people wrestle with this. I know why people get scared by this. I know why people don't get it, don't understand it, maybe even don't want to understand it. God, this is overwhelming. It's overwhelming for us to think about, for us to wrestle with. And Father, we have to admit that here we're pretty insulated from a lot of these things right now. And so even to place myself in the shoes of people alive today in our world, that these words are very much present tense, is hard for me to do. So Father, I would ask that you would help each of us to understand this chaotic world and to understand our faith and to place these two in a very healthy way together. Not so that we know some timeline or anything like that, but so that we would know how to live. We'd know what faithfulness looks like. We'd know what trust looks like. We'd know what love looks like. We know what making disciples looks like. And Father, I pray that as the birth pains continue, and as we're tested more, as the pressure increases, that we would be faithful. That in this relative peacetime, our faith would be built up so that when the heat comes, we're ready. And so, Father, I just pray today that as we go seek to be faithful this week, we would keep these things in mind. So no matter what is ahead of us this week, we could be faithful. We could just be faithful. And so, Father, I ask all of this in Jesus' name. Amen.